Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's cyber readiness session, which of course is the third and final webinar in our series. And today we bring it all together with a plan for how you create a cyber security incident response plan. I'm Collins Rex. I'm the lead of the Victorian Mets Export Hub, and I'm also a Cyber Readiness Institute Cyber Ready Coach, and I'll be your presenter for today's session. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we meet. And for me, this is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples who might be joining us on today's webinar. So without further ado, let's have a look at what we're going to be covering today. Initially, we're going to have a quick recap of exactly what we mean by cyber readiness and the core four, looking at business continuity planning basics, formulating a cybersecurity incident response plan, or CSIRP, which of course is the main focus of today's session. And finally, we're going to take a quick look at how you might respond to a ransomware attack, and simply because those are absolutely on the ascendant. So just to remind ourselves of what cyber readiness is. Cyber readiness is not about technology per se, but it is about changing human behavior. And the more emphasis one places on this, the more likely the behavior is to change, and to change permanently. So cyber readiness is taking practical steps to prevent cyber attacks by focusing on the human behavior that is related to four core issues. It's also about knowing what to do if an incident occurs and then responding appropriately to any breach. So in the series so far, and again today, we will focus on human behavior. We use guidance and tools on preventative measures and practical incident responses. We've helped you to create a cyber readiness culture, hopefully, and also encouraged you to commit to supply chain security. So the goal of this series has been to embed cyber readiness in the way every person in your organization does their job. Remember, people are the key. Processes need to be practical and simple, and technology needs to enhance cybersecurity while also enabling job performance. And it all hinges around the core four: passwords and multi-factor authentication, software updates, phishing, and USBs and secure file sharing. If you take care of the core four, the rest pretty much takes care of itself. So what exactly is a business continuity plan? It's simply having a plan to help you deal with difficult situations so that your organization can continue to function with as little disruption as possible. Now, there are many types of incidents that would be covered by a BCP, including natural disasters like flood or fire, utility outage, and in recent times, of course, we've seen some rolling electricity outages in a number of Australian states. Also things like supply chain disruptions due to any number of factors, including things like COVID lockdowns. But what we're focusing on today is cyber attack, and having a plan that helps you deal with that without having too much disruption to your business. So a business continuity plan is a document that outlines how your business will continue operating during an unplanned disruption in service. It's all fine and well to have a planned disruption and to be alerted to the fact that such a disruption is going to occur. So for example, your energy provider might let you know that they're doing scheduled maintenance and they're going to be taking certain parts of the grid down. But more often than not, disruption happens without any planning. A BCP is more comprehensive than just a disaster recovery plan, and it contains contingencies for business processes, assets, human resources, and also those outside of your immediate business, your business partners and stakeholders. In fact, every aspect of a business that can be affected by that unplanned outage. Plans typically contain checklists that include supplies and equipment, data backups, backup site locations, and the like, but they also help to identify plan administrators. They include contact information for emergency responders, key personnel, backup site providers, etc. And they also provide detailed strategies on how you maintain your operations for both short and long-term outages. Now, much as a business continuity plan is larger than a disaster recovery plan, that disaster recovery plan is a key component of your BCP. And it contains strategies for handling IT disruptions to networks, to servers, also personal computers and mobile devices that have been compromised, particularly in the case of cyber attacks. The plan is always about recovering and establishing productivity as quickly as possible so that your key business needs can be met. And manual workarounds are usually included in the plans as well, so that operations can continue until computer systems can be restored. We're all so terribly dependent on our computers that when our entire network goes down, it's very often difficult to do things manually. So it is really important that if you have a comprehensive disaster recovery plan, it also includes things like manual invoicing, manual acceptance of payments. If yours is a retail-focused operation and you have forward-facing customer service, how do you deal with that forward-facing customer service if you can't access online records, for example? Three primary aspects to any business continuity plan for key applications, and they include high availability, which provides for capability and processes so that the business has access to these applications regardless of local failures. Now, failures could be in the form of business processes in physical facilities. So a server farm, for example, the physical server farm might be attacked and therefore be taken down, but also in IT hardware or software. They also contain continuous operations so that you need to safeguard the ability to keep things running during a disruption, as well as those planned outages such as scheduled backups or planned maintenance. And finally, recovering from disaster. So how do you establish a way to recover a data center, for example, at a different site if a disaster destroys the primary site or otherwise renders it inoperable? Now, we've talked in the previous two sessions about how important it is for you to evaluate your greatest risk and to prioritize the systems and data that are most important to protect. That really is vital, and it's key to making sure that your disaster recovery plan and your incident response plan is effective. You also need to identify the most likely ways that these key priorities could be lost or damaged. And then you need to determine what would cause the most damage to your business. Is it data loss or public release of data, for example? Or is it damage from systems being down for days or even weeks, or even just hours? So we're talking here about business continuity. You also need to evaluate the direct financial costs, the costs of recovery, and of course, very importantly, and sometimes very difficult to quantify, the damage to your reputation and the cost incurred there. So in the case of cybersecurity, we're talking about two main areas that you need to prioritize, whether it's data loss or business continuity, and you know by now which are the various aspects that make up those two main areas. So let's look now at formulating a cybersecurity incident response plan. A cyber incident response plan is effectively a roadmap for what to do when something goes wrong. It's a detailed action plan. It's reviewed and it's practiced in advance so that when an incident does occur, nobody panics. Everybody knows exactly what to do. Everybody knows to bring the plan out and to simply follow the steps in the plan to make sure that recovery is as seamless as possible. Now, the Australian government's Australian Cybersecurity Centre recommends an incident response plan, which is quite a comprehensive and detailed one. And you see there that it includes of 5 major areas. But the reality is, for most organizations, those 5 steps can be simplified into just 3. And that's what we're going to be concentrating on today, to make it as easy as possible for you to get something in place quickly, and something that you can practice with your staff and implement should an incident occur. And the 3 main steps are preparation for a possible future incident, response, which includes detecting and analyzing and then responding during an incident, and finally recovering from the incident, which also includes containment and eradication of any incident that has occurred. So let's start with preparation. First of all, before you do anything else in your organization, and by now you would have implemented cyber readiness policies, but you need to back up any data in your organization, and you need to make sure that you can reinstall that data from backups. So practice it. Backup data and then practice reinstalling from that backup, and make sure that everything works as it did before you backed it up. Test your backups, and very importantly, make sure that any backups are disconnected from your network. There really is no point in backing up your data into the exact server where everything else lives all the time, because if you have an attack, not only will you lose what you are currently working on, but you're going to lose your backups too, which is kind of pointless, isn't it? So make sure that everyone is cyber ready and everyone knows how to identify a possible incident. And that means doing regular training exercises, including the phishing simulations that we chatted about last time. Test the cyber readiness of your staff on a regular basis. Survey them, ask them questions, ask them if they're aware of the current threats. Check those core 4 and make sure that they're aware of what they are, what the dangers are in those core 4, and how to implement the policies to protect them. Run some quizzes and so on, and do them on a random basis so that staff doesn't know that they're coming. Also make sure that everyone in your entire team knows how to report a possible incident. Even if it turns out to be a false alarm, far better to batten down the hatches and make sure that everyone is secured than to ignore something because somebody might think it's silly to raise an issue. And that means everybody knows who and how to contact people both internally and externally. And that includes IT support, customers that might need to be notified, law enforcement, your insurance company, etc. Now, of course, not everybody in the organization will have access to all of these channels. The appropriate people need appropriate access to the correct channels. Assuming that your preparation is done and everything is as it should be, when an incident occurs, you then need to respond. And that starts by isolating the problem. You need to isolate the device where the problem occurred, and that means you need to get that device off the network immediately. If it is a computer that has been compromised, that computer needs to be physically unplugged from the network so that it is no longer part of the network, and that will hopefully contain the spread as quickly as possible. If it's a mobile phone, same sort of thing. If it was plugged into the network to charge, for example, and the problem occurred there, unplug it as quickly as possible and make sure that all Bluetooth is disconnected as well. You then need to identify the type of incident and you need to take action. So in the case of malware, and malware is a Trojan, a virus, or a worm, or any other kind of malicious software that can harm a computer system or a network, you need to get the device off the network immediately, so physically isolate it. And that includes physically moving cables and cords, but also isolating through Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, etc. Make sure that that is disconnected. Credential theft, which of course is password compromise, often through phishing. Disable the device. You don't need to delete the account necessarily, but you do need to reset the password. And that is if all it is credential theft that hasn't gone any further. In the case of a data breach, and here we're talking about unauthorized access and disclosure of information, and that can come from any source, both internally and externally. There needs to be an emergency cybersecurity contact, which is usually the IT professional on staff or outside. They need to be contacted immediately and told about the breach. In the case of ransomware, which as we know is a tool that is used to lock or encrypt files until a ransom is paid, again, get the device off the network immediately and implement your ransomware policy. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later on today. In the case of denial of service or a distributed denial of service attack, which is where a service is overwhelmed by traffic. So this can be your website, for example, and that then impacts availability. Contact the person responsible for your network, and that could be your internet service provider, it could be the manager on site, or all of the above. You also need to determine the scope of the incident. So ask, when did the incident occur? People will sometimes be a little bit slow in coming forward if they think they have done the wrong thing and that has led to the compromise. So make sure you get a really accurate idea of when the incident occurred and how long you now have to respond after the initial incident. Who is impacted by the incident? Is it just your business? Is it an upstream customer of yours? Because that is very important as well. If you are in someone's supply chain, you have access to their network through your own network. If you are compromised, there's a very good chance that they've been compromised as well. And in the case of the Met sector, you are very often part of a mine's greater operation. So you need to understand, is it just you who's been impacted, or have they been impacted too? What is the technical nature of the incident? So is it malware? Is it something that's occurred as a result of phishing? Is it something that has happened as a result of a hard breach, for example, where somebody literally tapped into and hacked into your system? And how did it occur? You need to try to find out where it happened, where in your network the breach occurred, and the form that that breach took. And then also, very importantly, who knows about the incident? Is it just your organization that is aware of it? Is it one department in your organization? Or has the word of this spread beyond your organization in a way that might be beyond your control? The latter, of course, could lead to severe reputational damage. You need to understand the breach so that you can understand if you can control it internally, or if you need to call external support, and indeed if you need to report the incident more widely, and we'll talk about that in a moment. You then, once you have isolated the problem and you start dealing with it, you also need to ensure that it doesn't reoccur. So a breach might have entered through one device, you've removed that device from the network, and then you find it pops up elsewhere in the network because it has already spread and you weren't aware of it. So don't assume that just because you've isolated one part of the network, you are now safe. You need to classify the incident, and that means you need to determine the severity of the incident. And this is going to be slightly different for each organization, and we're going to look at some of the things that you're going to measure in a moment. But essentially, you're going to be looking at the effects of the incident. So what effect does it have on the confidentiality of data, for example, yours internal in your company, but also your customers' data, the integrity and the availability of information and systems, for example. How does it affect your stakeholders, both internal and external? What is the incident type? So what is the actual breach? And what is the impact on your business, on your customers, and on your broader community? Now, looking at some things that you might want to consider when you determine exactly how severe an incident is, We've looked at some things that you can effectively classify, and I've given you 4 incident classification levels here. For your organization, there might only be 2 or 3, depending on the sort of information that you carry and the sort of breaches that you might incur. So in the case of a critical incident classification, you might, for example, determine that over 80% of staff or several critical staff or teams are unable to work, and that is critical to you. It also means that critical systems would be offline, that there's a high risk to sensitive client or personal data, and you might put a value of an impact of greater than $100,000. You're also going to determine the severity to your reputational damage. And that, again, is entirely up to you to determine what classifies that as severe. In the case of high, for example, instead of having 80% of staff impacted, you might say that if 50% of staff is impacted, you consider that to be high. And so you can see through the various levels. Again, as I said, this is a really great way for you to think about, for your own organization, what constitutes critical, high, medium, and low classifications in terms of a breach. This is an example. You're going to determine each of those steps for your own organization. And again, just a reminder that these slides will be made available to you through the Austmine website, so you will have access to this example as well. Now, you're going to be responding through a number of different ways, and that includes incident notification and reporting. When it comes to notification and reporting, you have to consider the regulation and the reporting obligations that you have to comply with. And that includes sector, state and territory, and national incident notification obligations. It includes details about who in your organization is responsible for this incident notification and all reporting to external entities. You also need to include the details in your plan about the legal and regulatory obligations that are relevant to your organization. And if your organization is in a critical industry sector, this is legislated and you will be told what it is and you will have a record of it. It needs to be part of your plan so that the reporting requirements are clear to the staff that will be doing the reporting. And also, you need to identify the staff that are responsible for this. Work with your organization's compliance and legal team to ensure that your response plan meets all the relevant regulatory requirements. And again, you might have to comply with a number of different ones, depending on where you're located, what kind of industry specifically you're in, and so forth. Also include details about any additional legal or privacy considerations that may impact your responses. So have a look at your contracts with your customers and indeed with your suppliers. You may have clauses in there that specifically relate to cybersecurity and the notification of any breaches. You must make sure that you comply with those. And also understand what you have to do when you're going to lodge an insurance claim. Your policy is going to have certain things with which you absolutely have to comply. Now, again, looking at an example of the sort of thing that you might need to do. If you have had a ransomware attack, for example, you might need to notify the Australian Cyber Security Centre, and you can see an address and a telephone number there. And if you go to the website, you'll also see some of those key requirements for reporting. And this is if essentially your ransomware attack has implications for the broader community. You pretty much are obligated to report it. Certain data breaches as well need to be reported to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. And again, you see the website there. And if you go to the types of reporting that needs to happen, you can get those from that website. And so you will find that irrespective of the industry sector that you're in, there may be critical reporting obligations on you, and you need to make sure that you comply with those from a legal perspective. Now, you've done everything that you need to do to respond to the breach. Of course, damage would have occurred along the way, and that brings us to the recovery phase of your incident response plan. Everything you do in response to an attack revolves around containing the incident, eradicating the threat, and then recovering from the attack as quickly and as comprehensively as possible. So once the threat has been contained and eradicated, you need to reset all user IDs and you need to change all passwords organization-wide. You need to do a clean install of all your software from backups to ensure that nothing is hidden in the current software that you may not be aware of. And you need to update all your software once you have clean installed it. And finally, you need to restore all your data from your backups, but you only do that once you are sure that everything else by way of software, applications, etc., have been reinstalled, are working properly, and that there is no further threat lurking in any of that software. Now, bear in mind that eradication and recovery can take days, it can take weeks, it might even take months, depending on the size of the breach and the size of your organization and where exactly the breach occurred and how wide it's spread. You might need to consider a phased approach. So you may not be able to get everything back immediately and functioning as it did before the breach. So depending on the size of your organization and the extent of the breach, your early phases are going to be focused on increasing your overall security as quickly as possible. So effectively closing the gate to make sure that nothing else gets in and making sure that nothing spreads beyond that gate. And then later phases will be focused on long-term changes and also that ongoing work to keep your organization safe. And that brings us to the ongoing post-incident activities. So once you've stopped the incident, you've made all the necessary updates to your software and your security software, your organization's back on track, you then need to do some debriefing. And that means you need to reflect on what happened, find out how you can identify similar incidents in the future, and understand why they occurred and how you can stop them sooner. Assess the severity and damage to your organization. Very difficult to do immediately because some of these things will unfold over time, but you do need to understand the full impact. And if there was a successful external attacker or indeed a malicious insider, you need to think about those events as more severe and you need to respond accordingly. So if it's something that occurred as a result of a phishing attack, it's probably less severe than somebody who consciously hacked into your system and forced a breach. You need to revisit your cybersecurity incident response plan, and you need to see if there's anything you could have done to make that plan more effective, streamlined it perhaps, had better contact information, etc. And then you need to start the notification process. So do you need to release a public statement, for example, regarding a data breach? And if you function under GDPR, you probably have to do that. You don't really have a choice in that matter. And of course, then also go about refreshing your staff's cyber readiness awareness. You also need to regularly review your incident response plan. At a bare minimum, you need to do it every year to ensure that your security measures are working as designed, they're consistent with industry best practices, and best practice does change over time. And of course, technology does too, and hackers also get smarter. But if any changes have occurred in your organization, you need to immediately review your incident response plan. So the sorts of changes we're looking at are new applicable regulations. So if there have been any changes, for example, to the General Data Protection Regulation, or there have been any suggested regulatory changes by the federal government, etc. Also, any changes in data privacy and cybersecurity regulation, both at the state and federal government level, you might have to adapt your plan to incorporate these. If you've adopted any new technology in your business, so you've included new processes or procedures, you've installed new software, you've got new machinery in your manufacturing line, for example, that runs off computer programs and the like. So any new technologies that you've implemented in your business should immediately lead to a review of your incident response plan. Any changes in the structure of your internal teams that are involved in security matters. So any person that is directly involved in that plan, who is a key contact in the plan, if they change, you obviously need to update the plan. If your team grows, you need to update your plan. If your team gets smaller, you need to update your plan as well. You also need to think about new types of threats. So we all know what happened over the past 2.5 or so years under COVID lockdowns. People worked from home. So if there's any such a threat that leads back to distributed workforces in your organization, you need to review your plan. And of course, if you have suffered a breach, you immediately need to review your plan as well. So let's look at a security checklist for you to include in your plan. It needs to include an enterprise-wide risk assessment to identify the likelihood versus the severity of risks in key areas, and also make sure that your risk assessment is current. So where is the risk likely to be most severe, and how is it likely to occur? Also identify key team members and stakeholders, and that is very important. So who internally is key to the implementation of your plan and who externally. Also define the different security incident types. So what is an incident and who is in charge of activating the plan when an incident is perceived to have occurred. Make sure you've got an accurate record of all your resources and your assets, both software and hardware. Until you know exactly what you have, it's difficult to make sure that you've safeguarded it all. Also outline the sequence of information flow. So take a look at your assets. What do you need to do to kick off all the different processes? And then in advance, prepare a variety of public statements so that when an incident occurs, you've got the statements ready to release. Make sure you have the appropriate data breach notification letters ready to go. That way you will absolutely minimize reputational damage. Make sure that you've got public relations statements necessary to go so that you can just activate them. And prepare an incident event log. So keep track of all the steps you've taken during and after a cyber security incident. And that way you can gauge the efficacy of your response and you can learn valuable lessons. And this also means that if you need to inform your legal team or indeed report the incident to law enforcement, you've also got an accurate event log that you can simply present to them so that they also know how the incident occurred and every step in the process. So finalizing today's session and indeed our series, I just want to have another look at ransomware. So ransomware, as we know, is a type of malware from cryptovirology that threatens to publish your personal data or perpetually block access to it unless a ransom is paid. Some are quite simple. They lock the system, but they don't damage files. Others damage files and indeed make it almost impossible to restore them fully afterwards. And files are corralled and then a ransom in the form of cryptoviral extortion is levied. Typically, ransomware is carried out by a Trojan that is disguised as a legitimate file that the user is tricked into downloading or opening when it arrives. And this often comes as an email attack, or rather an email attachment in a phishing attack. Doesn't always happen. So the WannaCry worm, for example, traveled automatically between computers and there was no user interaction. Now, just a sense of how dangerous this is. Last year alone, 623 million ransomware attacks were reported. And those are the ones that were reported. Many companies choose not to report them because of the reputational damage. So if you do suffer a ransomware attack, preparation is crucial to fend off any such attack. So do those backups, test those backups, keep the backups off the network, patch any software every time a patch and an update is available. Do phishing training with your staff and have an incident response plan. In the case of responding, remove the infected devices from the network. If you've tested your backups, no problem, proceed to the recovery phase. If you haven't tested them, test them first. If you've not tested your backups, determine the criticality of your data. Try a real-time backup if you have to. Check insurance policies and make sure that you can claim for any damage that you've occurred. And of course, contact law enforcement. You do need to let the police know that you've suffered a ransomware attack so that they can follow up. And then finally, you need to make a decision internally before the attack occurs as part of your incident response plan as to whether your organization pays a ransom or does not pay a ransom. And that is a decision that only you can make from a business perspective. And then the recovery phase, reset any user IDs, change all passwords, do a clean install from your backups and update all software, and of course, restore the data from the backups once you have done all the necessary software updates. Now, I'm happy to share this schedule with you, which is a really good cheat sheet, if you like, for making critical decisions when it comes to ransomware. I certainly don't expect you to be able to read all that fine text off the screen, but just know that there is such a document available that hopefully will make your life a little bit easier. And that then brings us to the end of today's session and also the end of our three-part cyber readiness webinar series. So all that remains is to see if there are any questions. And I've also got my colleague Grant, who will be joining us to assist if we do have a sudden flood of questions. But please feel free to type them in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll take them as they come through. And if you can't think of any questions now, you're also more than welcome to drop me an email after today's session, and you will be getting a follow-up from Zoom just to say thank you for attending. So you'll have my email address. Feel free to share any questions and I'll answer them, or get the necessary advice if you've got something that is a particularly technical sticking point. So while you're thinking of any questions, I'm going to pass over to Grant, who's going to talk to you about some of the activities that we have coming up at the Victoria Met's Export Hub, and of course also some of the broader Austmine activities coming up that you need to make a note of. So Grant, I'm going to pass over to you. Oh,
thank you, Collins. I like a little bit of a dramatic pause there, Collins.
Caught you unaware there, Grant.
Yes, I was
you're busy fluffing up the hairdo or something, you know.
No, I was pinching the cheeks. Rouge going on there. So we've got a number of events coming up here at Austmine. Just firstly, thank you, Collins, for that. Very, very good, very thought-provoking. I've got a question for you. What would generally be, is there a percentage or a number known of which companies would pay a ransom?
No, no one ever discloses that sort of information, Grant. I think the reality is that most companies pay. It's generally easier just to pay and hope for the best than to fend off the attack and risk losing, particularly if it's a business continuity issue. But no, there are no statistics about companies that actually pay percentage-wide. But as I say, I think it's pretty high.
Do we know how many companies have? Again, I'm assuming they probably wouldn't say anyway. But do we know how many companies a year are getting held to ransom, so to speak?
Well, in 2021, 623 million ransomware attacks worldwide. And those are the ones we know about. So the reality is the figure is probably considerably higher. And the key about ransomware is it's not necessarily the biggest and the most valuable organizations that get held for ransom. It can occur across the board, and very often smaller companies are attacked in order to extort money from the bigger companies in their supply chain further upstream. So it really is a problem that occurs irrespective of the size of the organization, whether it's a tiny organization or a multinational. It can occur equally, and it's really prevalent in the healthcare sector. It's becoming more and more prevalent in the mining sector, but it's really wherever there are records that when they are held in check and you can't use them, the most damage is likely to occur. So, you know, if you're in a critical industry, there's a very good chance that you're going to be facing this sooner or later.
That means it's all the more important to get your ducks in a row prior to it happening, isn't it? So you can actually know
Absolutely.
what you should be doing if it does, or when it does happen, I suppose.
Absolutely. And that's why it is so crucial that backups of all systems, all processes, all data, all software is done on a regular basis, so that if you do suffer damage, hopefully you only lose the most recent files and the most recent data and not everything. But of course, it depends on what kind of ransomware attack it is and what it is that's actually held to ransom. If it's just data files and you've got a backup, you're probably going to be okay. But if it's also holding in ransom your manufacturing processes, for example, that's a little bit more difficult to just overcome by restoring data. So you really do need to be prepared and have a policy as to how you're going to respond to the attack, whether you pay, whether you don't pay, and what happens in either one of those scenarios.
Yes, I know it's a dangerous situation, a dangerous place that we face ourselves. So I'll go through some events. As you can see on the system that Collins has got up there, we've got our capability accelerator program for our Victorian METS export hub is kicking off again on Thursday with a capability acceleration program for market selection. If you're interested in looking at that, I think it's worthwhile attending. You'll certainly get some good information out of Collins and our other speakers as well. So then we go through on the 10th of August. The 11th of August is Peru Fresh Prospects for Australian METS. That's when we've got our in-country consultant, Ricardo, coming on to lead that presentation. I know some people would have been on the one that Don Duval was on last couple of weeks ago, which was very good from Canada. So that's a follow-up to that. Then on the 17th of August, Collins and I kick off the Regional Cyber Roadshow. So we'll be going to Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo, and Morwell. So if you're interested in attending any of those events, you're certainly more than welcome to. They're a mixture of breakfast and late afternoon events as well. So keep an eye on the Austmine website. And again, don't forget that on the 31st of August, we've also got our Smart Mining Networking event in Melbourne at Crown Plaza, which is across the road from Jeff's shed down there, so everyone knows what that is. And that's going to be on mining in 2023, giving some very good aspects as to what's actually people think of that. We've got a range of industry speakers coming on. That's going to be a moderated panel, so that'll be a good event. Again, as Collins has put up there, Australian GMG Forum in Perth. So that's another great one that's coming up at the 17th and 18th of August. So August is proving to be quite a busy month across Australia with our number of events that we're now running. So yes, keep an eye on the Austmine website. That's the best place to go. And of course, we've also got IMARC coming up. That's in November. So that's on 2nd to 4th of November. I know we're all looking forward to that. That's going to be a great event up there in Sydney. I think that's fantastic. And then we've got leading into next year, Austmine 2023 on the 9th and 11th of May. And we're also looking at running a Vic METS Export Hub event in middle to late of October as well for our METS Hub members. So we'll get some information about that out as well. So I think, Collins, if there's no one else with any questions, So that's the website to go to, because as I've often said, if someone rings me up and says, what's an event coming on, I'll be going to the Austmine website to check it out. So it's often easy just to go there and have a look and see what's out there. So Collins, back to you.
Thanks very much, Grant. And yes, as Grant mentioned, there's a raft of activities coming up, lots and lots of great events. And of course, the face-to-face events also have a really robust networking component to them as well. So please do go along to austmine.com.au and check out the full events list. Register for all of them as you can, and the physical ones, we certainly look forward to seeing you and meeting you face to face. So thank you everyone for your attention. It's been really great having you for these past 3 webinars on cybersecurity. Cannot emphasize enough how important this stuff is. So please take the time to think it through, to speak to your staff and to get it right, because it's just a matter of time before an incident occurs. Unfortunately, the statistics are against us all. So happy to take any questions offline. Thank you very much. Thanks, Grant. And thank you all for your attention. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we look forward to the pleasure of your company at our next session. So thanks, everyone. Have a good one, and goodbye.